Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope this will be beneficial. So I will start with just one observation. If it is true that God is love, and if it is true that coming to God brings rest and peace, as we have been told, then faith, the experience of faith should be an experience of delight, of joy. And a believer, the faithful, should be a source of joy and peace. If faith is not a delight and joy, if we pray only when we are in trouble, pressed, if we come to church only because we must or out of the habit, and then spend time in church arguing in a Sabbath school class, then these may be symptoms that our faith has probably become a problem. According to Gospels, this seems to have been a common problem at the time when Jesus was here. God's people whose life literally revolved entirely around faith. We had people of God, and everything was seen somehow forced, callous, without joy, calling on the name of the Lord without really knowing God. And then Jesus says of course, I mean, there is always a reason for his sayings. In Matthew 7, in the Sermon of Mount, he said, "Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?" And then Luke adds, "We ate and drank in your presence, and you taught in our streets." And then I will finish with Matthew, "And then I will declare to them, I never knew you, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness." So they listened to Christ. So we have a group of people who listen to Christ with their ears and ate from multiplied loaves and fishes, drink water turned into wine. They even managed to become prophets, exorcists, miracle workers. But in the end, it all turned out that all those things had nothing to do with God whatsoever. So imagine that. You are witnessing miracles, seeing visions, healing people, all by faith and in the name of God. Everything is, orthodox. You don't recognize God when he appears in the flesh. You do not understand him. Your way of thinking does not agree. His way of thinking does not agree with your soul. You're like at odds with him. But it turns out what you know quite well is how to spy on somebody, how to provoke people, how to plot, how to teach people to bear false witness, all in the name of faith. So that's what we have in the Gospels, the situation where a large group of people are completely immersed and devoted to faith in God, but all that had nothing to do with God. I call that folk faith, a faith that has not been contemplated at all, has not been has not entered into people's lives, minds, way of thinking. And it is quite possible that someone can be so folk faithful that he or she can even change geography, move mountains, share all his or her possessions, even sacrifice his or her life, and completely still miss the mark. Of course, those folk faithful, they read the Bible, and they read that Paul said that without love, which gives meaning to everything, which is the essence of God himself, there is, nothing without love. And they know that word, love, but they don't know what it means, basically. Because apparently, according to Paul, love is not just doing stuff. Love is not just giving, even if you give, or knowing stuff, or being talented, or whatever. When I think of love, I think of X factor. There is not the competition, but that X factor. That's something which is very hard to put your finger on, but it's obvious that it's lacking with somebody, who doesn't have X factor. So these folk faithful, they push the word love into their talk. But the result is complete, nonsense, a circus. They make a circus out of faith. And then, when it becomes public, that kind of talk, comedians pick up the scent, of folk faith, and they have a field day. Probably many of you know who George Carlin is. That's a comedian. He's now dead. He's not alive anymore. And he called such faith the greatest fraud, that ever existed, because that faith teaches people about a God who watches over them 24/7, and who has a list of 10 things that he doesn't want you to do. And if you do any of those 10 things, he has prepared a special place for you, full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish, and he will send you there to suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry, but he loves you. That God apparently loves you. And this is how, if this is how we envision God, then our faith has become a problem. I have had multiple experiences with people in Sabbath school classes being completely surprised by Jesus' saying, "He who sees me has seen the Father." When I go into their feelings, when I ask them, how do you feel when you listen to this, they say, no, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel, truthful. And when I just scratch a little bit, they say that they feel safe with Jesus, but they don't feel safe with the Father. And Jesus says, no, you should feel the same. And this is what folk faith has done to people. And folk faith comes from, it doesn't come from the Bible, it doesn't come from New Testament, maybe not even the Old Testament, it comes from the family. The God that Carlin criticized has nothing to do with God who revealed himself in Jesus, who said, "Who has seen me has seen the Father." Carlin's God is more like a dysfunctional parent, more like an alcoholic parent who combines tenderness and abuse in raising a child. And that kind of parents have lists. They're usually moody. You need to learn how to manage that parent. You need to learn how to recognize when you will be punished for the tiniest thing when that kind of parent enters the house. Some people report that even when they hear how a mother or a father walks down the corridor, they know exactly if they're going to get beatings or it's going to be fine. These kind of people who are brought up in that kind of environment, they learn what provokes the threats of those parents and punishments, but who love us, and do all these things for our own good. If I were to ask you, does your God have moods, behaviors, and characteristics that are similar to somebody who you know from your childhood, what would you say? Is it a God who is like Jesus, or is it a God who is more like my mom and dad, or some other authority from our childhood? Now, people who are raised, for example, by strict parents, this is not, new. They tend to believe that God is a policeman who keeps a record, and then punishes mistakes. People who are raised by unavailable parents, they tend to believe that God is not listening to their prayers. If you believe that this is what God is and who God is, then it becomes virtually impossible for you to get closer, get intimate with such a God in prayer or open up to him. In childhood, faith is being programmed. And it's kind of what we picked up from authority, figures of authority from our childhood. That basically becomes our default idea of who God is. And if our default idea of who God is that he's not listening, or he's not available, or he's the policeman, it is very hard, or it's very bad idea to open up to that kind of being. The only thing that I will be interested in is, if I had that kind of image of God, is how to survive him, how to get a pass on Judgment Day, how to not get noticed when he decides who will live and who will not. And the scriptures say that we should love such a being with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. Carlin, he did not mock God, who revealed himself in Jesus Christ, but he mocked God of folk faith. Folk faith is faith without joy or pleasure. It lacks love. It combines love and abuse and call all this madness love or faith. Folk faith is not created by the encounter with the true God, because as children we actually do not ask these existential questions, and we do not, we don't even No, there is a journey on which we will encounter God, to which we were called. Folk faith is created by a religious authority from the childhood that has made you afraid of God and his punishments. And when you grew up, you multiplied that religious authority by infinity, and that's how you got your false God. God is love. If people are being raised by parents who were in loveless marriage and never seen their parents being loving toward each other, how can we know what love means? How can we understand what that X factor is? And our parents are not 100% responsible, or even those religious authority figures. You cannot give what you have not received. Who knows what their parents did to them? I mean, that trauma, that generational trauma, that it goes back to Adam. And it's not just the parents, but also life. Trauma is not just from the childhood, from upbringing, it's from the hood, from the neighborhood where you grew up, whatever. People you were friends with. So it is interesting to interpret the second commandment in this context, which says, you shall not make yourself a carved image, an idol, a false god. And then you shall not bow down to them nor serve them. And then the text mentions the family. For I, the Lord your God, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon their children to the third and fourth generations, to those who hate me. So suddenly, from the talk about false gods and idols, suddenly the language changes and goes into the family. And I always found that odd until I have understood how generational trauma operates. Whenever we project a picture of parental authority or any kind of authority from our experience to God, we create an idol. Idols are created in the family and by the family. The fathers, according to second commandment, the fathers are responsible for the false images of God of the children. And that is why God wants to introduce himself to each one of us. The God of folk faith is not a mystery. You know him and you know how to control him because you just projected what is known to you to God, who is actually not known. And this image of God is basically, it's the most central thing to the quality of one's faith and to the quality of one's theology. The best sign that you are dealing with God revealed in Jesus is that you probably won't always be able to fully understand him. Augustine said, if you understand, it is not God. Or if you recognize him at the first glance, if he doesn't remind you of anything that you actually know from your experience, probably that's God. But if you recognize him, because when Jesus came to earth, people didn't recognize him. Why? Because they were projecting. They were projecting religious authorities to the image of God, to their understanding of God. If we feel fear or shame before God, later in life, people crave, that kind of people crave power and control in order to feel secure. And this is how bad theology, religious wars, hypocrisy, abuse of the weak, control of people, living at expense of others, and everything else that religion has become known of, that at the root of that whole thing is the fear and the shame that we are trying to cover up by the pretense of being in power and control. And none of that is love. None of that harmonizes with God's core nature. Bad theology is always theology of certainty, because it lacks wonder and lacks courage to actually go on a quest for answers. It's always about truth claims, because bad theology is always based on fear and shame. The faith of the peacemakers, the healthy faith, the healthy theology, and the faith of healthy theologians consists of love instead of fear, acceptance instead of shame, help instead of power, and freedom instead of control. These four things. And all of that God revealed in Old Testament and New Testament, and in history, and in Jesus. But you cannot see that. People who are raised in that kind of traumatized, who are traumatized but while they were growing up, their theology is just going to be set up for disaster. It is impossible to see God as love, acceptance, help, and freedom if we do not get rid of an idol that is merely a projection of the childhood authorities who made us afraid, ashamed, and taught us that love is power that controls. And the way of liberation is not through rebellion, but through separation with love. Our parents and our early authorities, early religious authorities, they did the best they could. They gave us what they received, which is not much. But they did the best they could, and but what we must do in order to actually live something else is to separate from them, spiritually to separate from them, in order to encounter the true parent and experience a new birth. I'm trying to give you concepts which are basically, they're big concepts, because this new birth, this expression is not accidental. We literally have to change family. We literally have to change authority. Those who end up having healthy faith and living faith must first cut spiritual ties with the authorities from their youth, in order to make space for the real parent to take them and lead them into a completely new experience of faith that leads to rest and delight, and which is not coercion and conflict. And that's my point. It's not very long. that's my point basically, and I would love to discuss now this with you in the rest of this presentation discussion.
Marko, you're digging deep here.
Yeah,
you're
okay.
digging not just into our theology, which I think we tend to keep kind of at arm's length, like here's a set of things I need to believe and a set of things I need to do. Now you're getting personal, my friend. You're digging into our psychology. I'll add, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in here. Is that okay, Marko?
Fine, yeah, just go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm gonna share a story or two myself. I've shared this story in a sermon that I preached not long ago, and a couple of you here who have heard this sermon may remember this story. Years ago, I remember walking past somebody in the narthex, and you kind of hear listening in what people are saying, and I heard this guy describing somebody who just was so angry at the church and at the people. And you're only half listening. It's not my conversation, but he's going on, and I'm thinking to myself, boy, whoever that guy is he's describing, I'm sure glad he's not a member of my church. And I said, that'd be horrible to have somebody who is that critical and that angry all the time. So I went by again and suddenly realized that he was talking to this other person. He was describing what he thought God was like. God was so horribly angry at all of us. I mean, that was his picture of God, and he was trying to kind of impose this picture of God on the whole church. And I remember talking later in a sermon and saying, think about the really nice people that you know. I remember my grandmother saying once, she said, or maybe it was my mother, it was one of these. She said, oh, so-and-so down the road, one of our neighbors, such a nice lady, the nicest lady I've ever met. She's so kind and she's so wonderful. It's just too bad she's not a Seventh-day Adventist. She's a Catholic. And this to me represented, Marko, this division between theology and love, theology and God. She could not accept that person as a really kind and loving person because they didn't have the same concept of truth. I mean, I've wrestled with this over and over again, Marko, and I don't quite know. And by the way, those of you who are here, start putting up your hands, and during this conversation, it's going to be really boring if it's just me and Marko talking. We need to hear from some of the rest of you, your conception of God. I mean, Marko, I think that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about how do you see God? And I think a lot of people see God as really angry, judgmental, just a pissed off person, somebody that we just that just hates us almost. And like you said, then they turn around, you say to children, Jesus loves me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. I think that's an extremely profound song, but I don't think very many people actually absorb it or actually believe it. If you know what I mean. Come on, some of the rest of you join in on this too. But Marko, I've always said to my church people, I said, think of some of the nicest people you know. Human beings, just plain old human beings. And you say, oh, that person is so kind, so good. Wouldn't it make sense that God is just that good and just that kind? And yet they don't see that, Marko. God does not fit into that frame of what we understand as goodness and kindness. God fits into a different frame, a demanding one, almost like the people who had to sacrifice their children to Baal. I mean, God is very demanding. He wants something really big and awful of us. I don't know, am I going along the same road that you're going here?
Asking me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, and this is crucial for theology as well. For example, people saying, "Well, we have the truth." Okay, the truth about Sabbath. But, you know, Sabbath for a person who is, you know, having this folk faith God, yeah, folk God, who comes from dysfunctions. It's a rule. But for a person who has a loving God, Sabbath is rest. Sabbath is freedom. Sabbath is delight. It's the same thing. You know, 7th day, you don't work, but it's completely different and opposite experience of everything. Completely. And yeah, you can, okay, I'll just, you know, it affects theology profoundly. It goes to the core of every single doctrine, okay? And you can feel it. You can feel it. Although somebody is saying plain truths from the Bible, you can tell that's not the gospel. That's not good news at all. These are just facts, and person who is presenting those facts, that person scares me. It's not good news. Yeah. Now there is a hand, so yeah.
Yeah, Tanisha, join our conversation here.
Thank you so much for this, Marko. This is amazing, and I wish so many people that I work with as a Christian counselor could absorb what you're saying. It reminds me of a meme I saw once that has guided how I parent my children, because I'm very cognizant that their relationship with me is going to impact their view of God. And the meme that I saw, it was a young man, probably in his late teens, that was in an accident. And he said, "I messed up. My dad is going to kill me." And next to him is the same young man, same accident. And he said, "I messed up. I need to call my dad." And I want to be able to model the kind of faith where it's not anchored in fear. It is, when you're in trouble, come to me. When you're happy, come to me. When you are sad, come to me. But at all times, come to me. So thank you so much for putting this all together so succinctly, which wasn't really a question, but, but thank you so much.
I'll just take the opportunity to comment. Do you actually feel, when you say, okay, I will try to model that kind of loving parent to whom their children will run to when they mess up, what an enormous challenge that is.
It is.
And that's what amazes me, that we as a church have not done much in that direction. We have done a lot of things in terms of getting the facts straight, okay? That's actually what we are, but we are not dealing with what kind of community, what kind of life we are actually spreading, you know, what kind of families albeit the result of our existence as a church, as a theology, etc. Okay, thanks.
Yes. Oh, very good. Thank you so much for that. I want to read this to you. Janet Prouty-Brock said, Sabbath as a delight has generally eluded me. It came with so many do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
This makes me think of an article. Oh, by the way, you'll be happy to know the new Adventist Today magazine will be coming out soon. It's titled on the cover, The Surprisingly Subversive Sabbath. And all the articles in it are alternative understandings or sort of off to the side understandings of the Sabbath, as opposed to just keep the Sabbath because God will be mad if you don't. You know, meanings of the Sabbath. I think you'll like it. But the piece that my associate Steve Chavez wrote, he referenced Isaiah 58, which, by the way, Olive Hemmings wrote the best article about that I have ever read. It's on our website. He referenced Isaiah 58, and he said, the way we've used Isaiah 58 and said, don't do your own pleasure on the Sabbath, he said, it amounts to this. Sabbath is a pleasure as long as you don't enjoy it. Mm-hmm. And I love that line. I think that's just a brilliant line, because that's exactly how a lot of us grew up. Sabbath is a pleasure, just don't enjoy it. So I loved your referencing the Sabbath. Marko, I've been writing lately a lot about what's happening over in your part of the country, your part of the world. Sasha from Germany, the pastor who came out as announced that he had a bisexual orientation, and how quickly the EUD and the GC jumped on him. Some of you will want to read that editorial. It's on our website, and it's gotten a lot of shares and a lot of attention. I ran across something interesting in Isaiah 56. As long as we're talking about the Sabbath, I'm going to throw this in. The closest we get in Scripture, according to some of my gay friends who use this, is the concept of the eunuch as a sort of a shorthand for somebody who has a different sexual orientation. And in Isaiah 56, it says, to the eunuch who keeps my Sabbaths, I will give great rewards. And I thought, here we are, Seventh-day Adventists, jumping in to reject people on the basis of a few questionable texts. And it says very clearly, to those with alternative sexual identities who keep my Sabbath, I will award them with something better than sons and daughters. They will be part of my family. At the same time, we Adventists are known for kicking people out of the family for having alternative gender identities. I don't know if does that make sense? So I'm going to bring, you can go ahead and comment, but I'm going to bring Angie into the conversation.
No, go ahead, Angie. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for this wonderful talk. Just a couple comments. When we have the picture of God in the Old Testament, and there is a lot of so-and-so was righteous, Enoch walked with God, that's why he's not here anymore. So there is that connotation of being right with God to be rewarded somehow. But then when you go to Micah 6:8, one of my favorite verses on the Bible, I think that description of what God wants from you, it's what God is in my view. And clearly says, to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. That's it. 3 requirements. Mm-hmm. It says nothing about anything else. And so when I read that verse, and I think it encompasses everything that God is, and I think in that verse and what he requires from us is exactly what I can see him as being, a merciful, a just. That's what he requires from us. We are made in his image, And that's what he is. He acts justly and he loves mercy. He's a merciful God. And we're supposed to walk humbly with him. To me, that's a summation of it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Angie. Marko, I've always loved that passage too, just similarly the way I love the passages on the good news in the New Testament. But let me expand Angie's question a little bit and lay this on you. Through the years as a pastor, I had a lot of people coming to me and saying, Pastor, I've read through the Old Testament and I'm really doubtful now whether God really is good. Numbers 5, going to make the jealous husband makes his wife drink the filth from the floor of the temple in order to see if she has a spontaneous abortion, or what is it, Numbers 30, I think, where God says, go out and kill them all, men, women, everything, except keep the little girls for yourself. Then there's another passage in Samuel where Samuel says, go and kill everybody, men, women, livestock, and make sure you kill their babies. And people read this and they say, I don't recognize a God that is any good. And what do you do with Marko, what do we do with the text? What do we do with the notion that the text is inspired, but it describes a God that is so repugnant to almost any right-thinking person?
Thank you. Great question, and I will gladly answer this. Every revelation of God that came to humanity came through human beings who are traumatized by living in this world. And that trauma, when you understand how trauma operates, how it paints everything, that trauma paints also how they perceive the whole thing. Okay? Therefore, if God wanted to reveal himself as he is, he had to come down. Moses was writing from the experience of somebody who was completely ostracized, abandoned, forgotten. And you have to understand this human side of the Bible, of the inspired text. I'm not saying that the Bible is, more or less inspired. No, it's inspired 100%. But what came through Jesus about the Father came through somebody who is in the arms, came from the arms, from the family of the Trinity. And that's not dysfunctional family. That family, that community of Godhead is true and pure love. And out of that love, out of that experience, Jesus revealed God. That's not the same as Moses. Okay?
Yeah.
I can read you what Jesus said about, about families. You have that text in Matthew 23:9. He said, do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your father, he who is in heaven. I mean, usually we apply that to religious authorities, okay? But I think the application is more than just religious authorities. Listen to what Jesus had to say about his family. When they came, in Matthew 12, they came, Ellen White mentions, and some other people as well comment on that they thought he was mad. And they came to, reason with him. And he said, who is my mother and who is my brother? Who are my brothers? and he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." And you can see that Jesus' his primary relationship was not with his mother, was not with Joseph, not with his brothers, but with his Father in heaven. And that's completely different from completely different family he comes and brings this revelation of Father in heaven. And that's why there is huge difference between how God in Old Testament feels and how God in New Testament feels to us. In New Testament, he feels much safer, much loving, still truthful and still serious, but you can approach him. Old Testament, it's completely different. Why? Because it went through the filter of traumatized people. All the revelations from God came through and you can tell, even in Ellen White, you have her early period, which was closer to trauma of 1844, and later period when she probably recovered a little bit from that trauma. And it's different, it's deeper, it's more, forgiving, it's more accepting. So there is that human part, which we have to understand in order to ourselves not become embittered. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I really see what I mean. You're giving us a psychological frame, a psychosocial frame for the Old Testament. I've said it differently, and I may be wrong in saying it this way, but I've just said to people that passage, that horrible passage there, does not describe God as God really is. It described God as some people of that time saw him or God. It does not describe as God really is. Am I going too far when I say that? In effect, I'm just saying that's wrong.
I would not say that you're wrong. I would just say perhaps that that's what they could. That's all with the trauma that they had, that they went through. That's all that they could pick up.
Yeah. The problem
and for that time, perhaps for that time, that was the best that they could have. And that's why when we get to the New Testament, we get to Jesus, we get access directly to God's heart and how he really is, how you really feel in his presence. Okay?
Yeah. I think most of us here on this call today, on this meeting today, would agree that Jesus is the thesis of Scripture. Jesus is the governing example and the governing words of Scripture.
And I'm sorry, and that's not something that is unorthodox. That's according to Adventist belief.
Yes.
That we say that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God over the Bible. Okay, it is written in the Bible, but he's a person, and he's the ultimate revelation of God.
Dr. Law Rendell at the seminary, I don't know if any of you have studied with him, he used to say, never look at the Old Testament without looking through the lens or the filter of the cross. Everything has to be filtered through the cross. You don't read a single thing and jump over the cross. So you don't read, oh, here's a death penalty in the Old Testament, so let's introduce a death penalty. He says, no, you got to look at that and say the cross filters it out because Jesus died for everybody. You don't look at even food rules or whatever it is. The cross, you look at it through the cross, and the cross filters out all of those things that are demanded in order to be saved and replaces them with grace. And that's been very useful to me through the years, Marko. Olive, maybe you can help us with this too. I'm sure with your students, you have struggled through some of these things where people say, how could this passage possibly describe a God who I would have the slightest interest in being associated with?
Well, I like Marko's psychoanalysis of it, but to me, that's a long conversation that requires a whole other class. I want to, however, pick up on the messianic ethic there, because we see the messianic ethic from the Old Testament, the Hebrew prophets, that a lot of what we see perhaps in a somewhat angry, vicious God in the Old Testament seems to be mitigated by the prophetic writings, which much of them, especially Isaiah, focuses on that messianic liberation, which is what the early church picked up on and ran with it, the messianic liberation. So what they were trying to do is they were reinterpreting what had become a political interpretation of Messiah by the first century and going back to the prophetic interpretation of Messiah. The Messiah is indeed a true liberator. And that's what Paul picked up on. And that is why I want and hope that for some class, we might discuss the whole concept of Christ. Of course, Christ, Messiah, same word, meaning, same meaning. That perhaps you want to discuss the difference between Jesus and Christ, because there's a difference there. There's Jesus and there's Christ. And while Jesus became the Christ and was the Christ, the early church was focusing on Christ and how we too can take on the Christ life and how we too can experience that liberation that comes from Christ. Remember Christ, remember Messiah is the great liberator. But the early church brings in and talks about that Christ as one who truly liberates us from this need to be right over against the other person. And we see Paul actually works very, very rigorously on it in the letter to the Corinthians, first letter to Corinthians and Romans. If you go to Romans 14, we see him even zero in on it. And I don't know how Adventists and other true churches interpret this part in Romans 14. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? Some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their own minds. And he goes on to make this crazy statement. He says, I know and I'm persuaded in the Lord that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for everyone who thinks it's unclean. And he continues the conversation. But we see in every summer point in Paul's conversations, in all the ups and downs, the dogmatic controversies in Corinth, in Rome, he comes back to one single thing. That in Christ ethic, that messianic ethic, which is an ethic of love, where he said, oh, no one anything but to love another. 1 Corinthians 13, we think 1 Corinthians 13 is a marriage chapter, but it is a pause point in the whole Corinthian letter where it says, let's come to the point. Let's come to some point of sanity here. All that you think you know will pass away. It's only temporal, you know. Now we know only in part, we prophesy only in part. But the thing is, as religious people, we want to know everything fully. We want to know more than anybody else. We want to know it all fully. Paul is saying now we can only know partially. But the question I'm coming to Marko is this. How do we really, as a church, help people to experience that deep liberation, that Christocentric liberation, while keeping us together? How do we make people understand that they don't have to have some truth to be part of the kingdom of God, or believe some part of the truth to be united with Christ and to be one with God. How do we begin to work that in? Because I have a burden there. Sometimes I have a burden for people to feel that sense of freedom. And I don't know, but I don't have to know, that I'm content to stand in the mystery of who I am. And I often say, how does one get a community of faith to that point and yet keep us together as one people? You know, how do we do that? You get what's going on in my mind, Marko? You know.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, liberation from what? That's the main point for me.
I think just from self, from the ego, from the need to be right, liberation from, you know, our impulses to put ourselves above others, our impulses to perhaps even know everything.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. All these impulses come from one source, and that is fear.
Yeah.
So the liberation is from fear.
Yeah.
And that comes,
that's right. That's true.
That dovetails with what actually Jesus was, you know, liberator from: sin, fear, you know, that kind of the way we actually see the world, not the Romans, you know, or the white people, or the, you know, the rich, or the, you know, those oppressors. No. How do we get to the point? Well, I think when it comes to Seventh-day Adventism, one thing that we need to get rid of is this Puritan influence. We do not tolerate sinners. We do not tolerate, we are more interested in presentation, which is blameless. We are not prepared to actually speak about the struggles that we are going through, about problems that are stronger than us. We love experiences of how somebody has conquered something, but we do not have spaces or space in the church which is safe for Adventists to be just sinners, to be the work in progress. And we fear excommunication. We fear that the church will, that's the main Adventist fear, at least in my country, that the church will, you know, declare that I'm not worthy, that I'm not an Adventist anymore, that they are ashamed of me because I have something in my life that I have struggled with and I haven't conquered. When we get to those, you know, safe places, then, you know, if somebody here knows what kind of atmosphere is on 12-step meetings, then you will understand that suddenly the whole world becomes quiet and people relax. Why? Because they already struggle with the sin. They already struggle with those flaws, character flaws, and they need support, they need prayer, they need a group which will help them overcome that, lead them, not by giving them lectures and quoting, you know, oh, this is the good book and that is the good book and Ellen White says this and that. No, just be person to person, be humanely there and go with them through the struggle. Yeah. But we don't have that. I mean, we do not cultivate that.
Yeah. I like the whole concept of fear, because yes, fear is really what we need is liberation from, fear. And very currently we're talking about LGBTQ persons. There's this fear to just give them spiritual care. What's happening? And so not only are we afraid of giving them spiritual fear, they themselves even stand in fear of who they are. And we don't know how to help them bear the burden of who they are in the world. Because like I said, we're just surrounded by this cloud of fear. Fear that I don't believe this, fear of questioning God, fear of just fear.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a question of nurturing. I just believe that the image of God, I think we need to begin to nurture just the image of God. We need to start giving spiritual care, because I think that pastoral work has really been about running a church, doing evangelistic crusades, winning souls. It's not about spiritual care. And I think we need to get back to that fundamental part of pastoral ministry, and that is giving spiritual care.
Yeah, but Adventist identity, Adventist ecclesiology is ecclesiology of the remnant. And the remnant is defined by their mission, which means that Adventists are missionaries. They're not pastors. They go out, they baptize, and they move on. They don't nurture, they don't feed the sheep. Right? That's in our identity. Okay, others will. That's not good. I mean, for example, there is you said we have the need to be right. Why do we have the need to be right? Where that comes from? It comes from dysfunctional families. It comes from the family in which father will punish you if you do not know the right answer. That's not God. And I said these four: love instead of fear, acceptance instead of shame, which means acceptance, even the mistakes, help instead of power. So if I define myself as a being who is not in power, but who needs help, that's where God's space is in my life, okay? And then you have freedom instead of control. So if we organize the churches around love, acceptance, help, and freedom, that will be a completely different church. And I don't think it will fall apart. It will fall apart. I think we will lose controllers. We will lose control freaks.
I wanted to mention that when I was a young pastor, when I graduated from seminary, I attended one of these, my ninth quarter was the Lake Union Soul Winning Institute. I don't know if any of you remember that. And it was being taught by Mark Finley at that time. And I remember Mark Finley saying, and all of this still shocks me when I think about it. And he'd say this over and over again. He said, the purpose of your ministry is to sell the gospel and get people baptized. And people said, but what about pastoral care? He said, as long as you're doing evangelism and you have all your people involved in evangelism, nobody needs pastoral care. That will take care of all of your pastoral care needs. Once they're evangelizing, they will have nothing that they need to be counseled about or comforted about. He said, you can just about eliminate that. I still remember that. It's astonishing.
Do you know what that is in that chart of different addictions? That's workaholism. If you want to solve your problems, which you cannot solve, just work. That's workaholism. Just, I'm sorry to say, but Pastor Finley, he's telling people to get addicted to work in order to solve their spiritual problems. That's not, I mean, when you get, retired, what then?
Yeah.
All those unsolved problems will get you when you're weaker, when you're old.
Mark worked so hard even during that quarter that he ended up in the hospital, and he's close to 80 years old now, and he's still working.
Yeah, well, that's how workaholism. He cannot, if he stops working, everything's going to catch up. Yeah.
Olive, I wanted to, you asked about, both of you are talking about finding a community. Can we find a community where we do this? I'm going to read a little thing to you, if you don't mind. This is from evangelical preacher Chuck Swindoll, who I don't agree with completely, but I like this story. He said, an old Marine buddy of mine, to my pleasant surprise, came to know Christ after he was discharged. I say surprised because he'd cursed loudly, fought hard, chased women, drank heavily, loved war and weapons, and hated chapel services. A number of months ago, I ran into this fellow, and after we talked a while, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, Chuck, the only thing I still miss is that old fellowship I used to have with all the guys down at the tavern. I remember how we used to sit around and let our hair down. I can't find anything like that for Christians. I no longer have a place to admit my faults and talk about my battles, where somebody won't preach at me and frown and quote me a verse. Chuck says, it wasn't 1 month later that in my reading, I came across this profound paragraph. The neighborhood bar is possibly the best counterfeit that there is to the fellowship Christ wants to give his church. It's an imitation dispensing liquor instead of grace, escape rather than reality, but it is a permissive, accepting, and inclusive fellowship. It is unshockable. You can tell people secrets and they usually don't tell others, even want to. The bar flourishes not because most people are alcoholics, but because God has put into the human heart the desire to know and be known, to love and be loved. And so many seek a counterfeit at the price of a few beers. With all my heart, this writer concludes, I believe that Christ wants his church to be unshockable, a fellowship where people can come in and say, I'm sunk, I'm beat, I've had it. That's a little story that Chuck Swindoll tells. And I always found it very moving because the fact of the matter is, I have never, in all my 40-some years of being a pastor, known a church where you could actually be transparent and not be judged or criticized for it. I hate to admit that this is true. Do any of you? Would you go into your church and tell them your deepest problems? I would never. Ed?
Good afternoon. It's a little intimidating to follow up on that dialogue between Olive and Marko. Of course, I always hate following Olive. She actually knows what she's talking about. So I want to pick up on what may have been the main subject of their dialogue, which was fear. We've all read stories of people who have left a group of people among whom they've grown up. Could have been Amish, could have been Mormon, could have been the wife of one of 10 wives of a Mormon man. Could have been Muslims, could have been the people that followed David Koresh. We watched just a couple of weeks ago, we watched a documentary on Waco and the burning of the compound there. And they interviewed some people who survived, who were in tears, still believing that David Koresh was God. And for people to leave their roots, to leave what it was they so firmly believed in and had thought was right and go somewhere else is bound to generate fear and guilt, because the early lessons and the early indoctrination, shall we say, was so strong. So, and yet in where they were, they may have experienced fear of one kind. Then they work up their courage and leave, and that probably generates fears of another kind. And the question is, how do people manage the transition where they're leaving one way of seeing the world and moving to another way of seeing the world. And in that transition, they experience fear and guilt for leaving behind what they once knew was right. How do we help people through a transition like that?
Well, if that's a question for me,
Yes.
I didn't have that experience. I can't speak with authority. I can only say that I added through the 12 steps programs to what Adventism didn't give me. I added, I didn't leave. I have been marginalized because of that, but I haven't been expelled. There was for many years, there was like a persecution. Some people from the church wanted me to lose my job. But that never happened. Because on the other hand, what I was talking about, there was a question about in the chat, was there a church in which you could be honest? I was honest. I was honest. I was honest from the pulpit. And that's something that probably, it helped me that I'm a pastor. It helped me because, you know, when I can be honest, then other people can be honest too. And kind of I found my niche. And but I cannot give advice. Yeah, this is the way. No, I don't want to do that. That was my journey. And was I lucky? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe this is the way. Well, Ellen White says that, in 1888, if people were more vulnerable and honest, the pastors, Jesus would come already. Yeah. And she was pressing. She was, maybe I can make another presentation on this, on her view of confession to another person. There is many quotes from her. She was very, she wanted that. And there was, in those meetings under the tent, there were small rooms, small, spaces where people can actually confess to another person in the beginning of Adventist movement. So, as I said in my presentation, the going away, leaving the church would be rebellion. I would say when I said it's separation with love, separation from authority, and actually in the church finding, taking the journey to find God again, or maybe for the first time. Okay, and that can be done in Adventist church. That can be done in Adventist church. I mean, that can be done in any church. The doctrine doesn't, the doctrine here is not crucial. Any tradition, yeah, Christian tradition, you can actually find and be settled and be fulfilled with that new journey. But I don't know how many people will be from the church, will be part of that journey, because we think that we have found. That's our main problem, that we think that we have found, and I think we haven't. I think we we analyzing and systematizing the experience of walk with God of the first generation of Adventists. And we don't understand this truth that God doesn't have grandchildren. He only has daughters and sons. And that's always God, it's direct revelation to people who are trying. That's, you cannot, I don't like to quote. I like to write my own stuff. Why? Because I have experience. I have what, you know, I have my own journey. And I joke about the Bible. The Bible is unfinished book because there is 66 books in the Bible. I don't know if I've mentioned that here. There is 66, yeah, which is very suspicious number, right? And there is a reason why there is 66, because there is 67. Needs to be written. The experience of the one who is reading the Bible. And that's what everybody in the church has to have. Not to quote somebody else, but to have his own epistle. The living epistle. And that's, you know, we have to have courage to actually take that journey. And that's it. And it can be done in the church.
I'm going to move on to Dr. Ness. Hi, Brian. Are you and Judy well?
Well, actually, we have a cold today, and so we didn't go to church at all and decided to tune in here, which is always nice. We have that opportunity.
I'm not glad you had a cold, but I'm glad you're here.
Yeah. And I feel like, Ed, you know, all this stuff's been said that I really wanted to kind of say, but maybe I can say it in a little different way, and maybe we'll think of something that way. I want to go back to the kind of the base level here for a moment, because the whole thing was about faith. And, you know, what does that actually mean? Faith. And I think, let's say faith in the Bible. And I think that maybe the Adventist Church, one of its flaws that gets us to where we're talking about here, where we have this difficulty, is that the way we view inspiration. Because if the Old Testament, if everything that's there is exactly what God wanted us to read, we got a problem, it seems. And we have recognized that when Jesus came, he said, I am the truth and the way. And, you know, he talks about, and in fact, Jesus contradicts the Old Testament numerous times in his teachings. And we don't often acknowledge that. We kind of, well, yeah, okay, he has said what he said. And then we kind of squirrel around and figure out ways we can reinterpret Old Testament texts and all kinds of things. But maybe Jesus was saying some of the things they said back then were just wrong. They were not the right way to view God. They just weren't. I'm here to show you what it is. And I wonder if that, and then add that to the second problem. And I liked your Marko, the one you said where the sign of bad theology is the need to be right. I think that really is it, because we have this idea the Old Testament is this inspiration, it's all inspired almost verbally. I think some people actually believe it to that level, and that we have to figure out what it's saying, and we have to know exactly what it's saying. We have to have it spelled out. And there's our evangelism. We teach people what's the right way to read the Bible. And that's where we drop people off. And then I want to also just make one comment about, have I ever been to a church, like Lauren, you said, you never been to a church that could allow you to really be open and honest about what's going on in your life. And I'm same here. I haven't been to one, but I have been to 12-step groups. And wow, that's a totally different environment. In a 12-step group, everybody is included. And it doesn't matter what your struggle is.
Yeah.
And the focus, of course, is on how can we help you in your struggle? You know, how can we support you? And everybody's there for you. You're there for them. And just can't imagine what a wonderful place it would be. And then to add to that, I think of Jesus when I read in the New Testament about him going to dinner with Matthew and other people, and it talks about him being at dinner with the sinners, with prostitutes, with, you know, the eunuchs, with, you know, the tax collectors and so on. That sounds like a 12-step group to me. I mean, you know, so it's like, that's the model.
The company, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So why is it that we can't somehow recognize that, you know, we're all flawed, and it's not, and we're not going to get rid of our fears by knowing all the right answers. That's not how we're going to fix all our fears. The only way to fix our fear of, well, rejection, and that's really one of the base fears we all have, is to make sure we have an inclusive environment where we can really talk about my fears. And that's it. We can't talk about our fears at church, because the minute I say I'm feeling doubtful about something, people are like, oh, you can't do that. You have to have faith. You know, you have to have faith. I mean, the minute you start doubting anything, oh, you're losing it. You know, you're gone. And people don't even want to be around you if you have doubts. And so to me, that's the root issue. And I think that it comes down to inspiration. How do we view inspiration even? You know, how does God speak to us? And I think that the 67th book that's how God speaks to us too. Because it's as we read those words that other people were struggling with, trying to say, here's who God is, and they didn't know really very well. They did the best they could. Now I've got to start joining that conversation too, and getting to know God somehow. And I'm helping to write that book. And I think that's the missing piece to me, that we're not allowing that.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Very,
I don't know if
very
I've
good,
added or not.
very good, Brian. Yeah. Somebody just mentioned here, they said, I have not found that honest place in churches, but I'm finding it here at Adventist Today Sabbath Seminar, and I'm really glad to hear that. I have to tell you that I have told you here more stories than I've ever told anybody else, because I feel it's a safe place too. So, and I appreciate all of you. Some of you I know and hang out with in person, like Brian Ness, and I really appreciate the community that we have here. Tanisha, you're back again. Let me get you to unmute.
Yeah.
There you
Yes.
go.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. This is a question for you, Lauren, as much as it is for Marko. So when we talked about the way God is revealed in the Old Testament versus the New Testament, and Marko gave us that beautiful psychoanalysis, which I made note of, that revelation is filtered through human trauma. And Lauren, you followed that up with viewing everything through the lens of the cross. My question is, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how the church has been abusive in its theology, and so many things that we were taught growing up, and we all shared about the trauma that we experienced. Can we take all of those teachings and view them through the trauma of those that were teaching us, that they were doing the best they could with what they knew based on where they were and what they had experienced? And if we can view it from there, can we begin to move to a place of forgiveness? Because in our own trauma, we are trying to learn to teach differently despite our trauma. Can we then offer them grace for their inability to do that?
Oh, I love that. I love that, Tanisha. Absolutely. I think often of my mother, who would tell me how terrified she was growing up. She grew up with people who would sit and spend Sabbath afternoon reading horrible descriptions of martyrdoms from Fox's Book of Martyrs. And even though she knew that it was scary and awful, she never knew how to soften that message to her own children, at least to me. She didn't know how to heal it or ameliorate it. And so to a certain extent, although probably not as bad as she got it, she passed it along. So you're right, Tanisha, she passed along her own fear, her own trauma. And you make me realize that I have to forgive her for that. And I really appreciate that insight. Marko?
Yeah, that's what they received. And that is absolutely the way forward. And it's not, it's not through the rebellion, but it's through forgiveness. And forgiveness always comes from love. Okay, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Okay, as Seventh-day Adventists in this time. Okay, but we don't have their experience; we have ours. So we have to actually grow further than them. We're called to grow further. We cannot go back in time and make our church resemble 19th century. That's gone. Okay, we are facing nuclear holocaust and all the fears that are coming from, perhaps many of us or our children or grandchildren not actually having families. How do you sustain faith in 21st century? Okay, with these issues. That's not what our pioneers faced. That's what we face. And I don't know how you look at it, but I think that's much greater challenge than they had. Much greater. What they had was struggling with the fact that what they thought was real was not real. That was their challenge. Our challenge is much more real. Okay, and what I would like to have is a Seventh-day Adventist church who is mature enough spiritually to actually deal with that and bring hope to the world today, not to try to reset the timer to the 19th century.
As you're speaking, and I'll say this to you as my pastor today, since you're in charge, I find myself, I'm in my 60s, and I find myself still working through the trauma that the church put me through as a young person. And I find this just very, very sad. In fact, I'll tell you another story I'm sharing one of the deepest stories from my heart here. Back in 1989, my father was dying very young of cancer. He was only in his 50s. And I took time out to go to North Dakota and sit with him in the hospital because my mother had cancer at the same time and was incapable of being there. So you can imagine this was huge trauma for our family. So I'm sitting there with my father, and I was a sort of what you might call the designated religious of the family. I was the pastor. So I'm sitting there with my father, and I'll tell you what made me more angry than anything. And at this moment, as I tell you this story, Marko, it makes me angry. My father had been a lifelong Seventh-day Adventist, his parents lifelong Seventh-day Adventists. He had gone to church all of his life. He had preached sermons, and he's laying there in his deathbed and saying, "Lauren, I don't know if I'm going to be saved." And I thought, I mean, you can just imagine sitting here, and I'm looking at this man who I know is going to die within a week or two, holding his hand, praying with him. And he's saying, "I have no assurance of salvation." And I thought, how faith, how religion has let my family down. They did not give this good man who tried his very best, not a perfect man, but a good man. He went through his whole life trying to serve what he thought was religion. And in the very end, he had nothing to assure him as he went to his grave. Doesn't that make you angry? I mean, as I tell you the story, Marko, it makes me angry. And I determined I would do everything I could as a pastor to always give people assurance of salvation. I didn't mess around with doctrines. I didn't mess around with anything else other than to say, yes, you have assurance of salvation. You can know that you are saved. I can't tell you how many times I said that to people. I don't know if they believed me. but that was a major traumatic turning point in my life, to see my good father laying at the door of death and saying, I have no assurance, no peace that God is going to save me. There you go, Marko. I laid my heaviest story on you.
Thank you for sharing, Lauren. And this is actually what makes this church life whole and warm. This kind of stories. Stories of loss and disappointment, trying to find again hope despite that. That's basically Christian faith.
Yeah.
You know, dying on a cross without no reason, but then finding a way to pray the prayer, forgive them because they don't know what they do. Okay, that's Christianity. That's because it comes to existential things, to existential questions. And yeah, I agree. Thank you very much.
Bob Ferreira.
Yes, good day to everyone. I'm probably the only person on this call that has never been a Seventh-day Adventist and has an interest in that church for reasons that have nothing to do with a particular doctrine, but the way the church is. I spend my time, I'm 84 years old, retired. I have a doctorate in business and have spent most of my business life as a consultant. And my avocation has always been to study the world's religions, because I had started on the premise that God was above all religions, that it didn't matter very much what religion you were in. And one of the things that interested me about this group, and I considered it very much of a privilege. I thoroughly enjoy what you all do here. I think what you're doing is extremely important for the church as a structure. I think that of all of the sects that I've studied, the Seventh-day Adventists have a better sense at the local level of what church is, but it's very difficult for anybody to be a little different. Of course, the arguments of pro and con about Ellen White make that part of the whole thing kind of obvious to an outsider, which I definitely am. I heard Marko's first presentation some time ago, and when I saw that he was coming back on, I was very excited to hear him again, because of all the speakers that I've heard on this forum, he seems to be concerned about your personal relationship with God, very much a responsibility as an individual, as opposed to a member of the church. I find that very interesting. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going to happen to the organization of the church with what I consider to be a real difference between the opinion of the North American members who consider themselves the founders, the founding group, and the rest of the world of the Seventh-day Adventists, which seem to have somewhat of a more conservative view, particularly when it comes to the role of women and who should get ordained, and kind of trivial issues, like I consider trivial issues. That a lot of what Marko was trying to say, I think, and which I have found in all the religions I have studied, is that you need to figure out how to love God yourself. And if you're lucky enough to be in a situation where there's a lot of support from your local church, and you look at your local church as a part of your family, that structure is very helpful. But you got to get the right kind of starting points about where all the scripture needs to come into focus. The vast majority of scholars, and I can say that I probably have studied most of the scholars who address the various scriptures and their religions, including Christianity. And I would say that most of the very serious scholars have wandered away from the religion that they study because they lose faith in scripture. And I think you should take that, if it's a bunch of serious people, I think you should take that to heart, because I think that it's very important that that you all kind of deal with that. I think that the reason this forum exists is because many of you seem to have been retired pastors, obviously are taking another look at what happened to you and how you relate, and to bring on someone like Marko, who's sort of asking you to dig a lot deeper, I think is a wonderful thing. And I want to thank you all, and particularly Lauren, who invited me on to let somebody from the outside participate. It's been a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate having you here. Yeah, it's interesting to have people from the outside. By the way, I should mention I have a friend who is one of the leaders in a group called Progressive Christianity, centered on the United Church of Christ. And he has invited us to open our class to the members of his group, and I've been thinking about it. However, the one thing I would mention is that what they mean by progressive Christianity and what we mean by progressive Adventism is quite different. So I've been thinking about it and considering it. But you know, Bob, we who are very deeply culturally and otherwise involved in the church, we're very, very aware of this tension between Western church and the rest of the world. And we're very aware of the tension that the General Conference and our leaders are in. And frankly, I don't think most of us probably feel that they haven't handled it very well in knowing how to span the difference. They've put in deep stakes and said, no, it can only be one way, rather than sort of a sense of freedom and openness to different ways of looking at it. It's been a struggle for people like me and Marko and a lot of the folks here on this forum. Marko, did you want to respond to that before we open the floor to Emmanuel?
I just wanted to say thank you, Bob, for actually clarifying this for me, because it was, it's nice when somebody from the side tells you how you look. It really touched me. I would also want to add is that what I'm about is that I'm trying to find people for this journey. And that's, it's not just about me personally with God, but I know that, God is the Trinity. And I think that if I'm going to be the image of God, I need at least one more with me. I cannot be the image of God just by myself. And that's why it has to be in the group. It has to be with people. So I'm just adding that. Thank you.
Well, we're very grateful that you're with this group of people.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
You have enriched us. Marlon Thorne asks, while some of you are still online, I'm going ahead and also asking some of the questions in the group, in the chat, if you don't mind. Marlon Thorne asks whether our interpretation of end time prophecy, our focus on prophecy way more than anything else, and even, Marko, I think it would be true to say that even our Sabbath has been made into a prophetic understanding rather than a personal relationship sort of thing. Is it possible for us to experience the God of absolute love when we are so very focused on end time prophecies? And I think that's a really good question.
Okay, I'll try to answer. First, we are not focused on prophecies because we are obsessed with prophecies. We're focused on prophecies because of our beginnings. We're focused on prophecies because prophecies were the source, the wrong interpretation of prophecies were the source of our biggest trauma.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's our focus. If we want to focus on God, who is absolute love, we have to find our own journey today as Seventh-day Adventists. That's my answer.
Yeah.
Because theology is basically systematization of what we've experienced in connection with God and one another.
Oh, I really like that.
Theology comes after that experience. Well,
see, now that's not how it's presented to us. It's presented to us as the thing that comes first.
Yeah. That's Fritz Guy. Okay,
well,
so
we got
theology comes later. Yeah. So
take this down, everybody. Write this down. Your theology is probably a reflection of your experience rather than something that comes first and shapes your experience. I really like that. Wonderful, Marko.
Yeah. So if we want different connection with God, we have to make that connection first, and then write our theology as a systematization of our experience with God.
No, very good. Emmanuel, join the conversation, would you please?
It's a beautiful conversation, and I wonder if there is a solution for this conversation. I am afraid that Seventh-day Adventist soteriology is responsible for the madness facing us. We advertise justification by faith, but we deliver justification by work. When somebody say, if you eat meat and you are a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, you cannot be translated. So the question is, what part of Seventh-day soteriology, what part of Seventh-day Adventist ecclesiology is responsible for this madness? And what are the solutions in sight? Let me give you an example. I am in a Christian forum, Seventh-day Adventist forum, with attorney, and I posted the article about what's going on in Rwanda, how the church supported the new rule against homosexuality. So I say, okay, as an attorney, how do you react to the position of the church? And number two, as a member of the community of faith, how do you react to this article? It was last week. I'm still waiting.
Let me just come back to how I view theology. I don't see theology, well, theology is a problem when you don't have your own walk with God. Then the only thing you have is a theology. Okay? As I said, theology is a systematization and trying to put your own experience with God, which is mystical, which is very subjective, into objective terms. Okay? And then when you don't have that walk, from which your own theology comes out as a systematization of your experience with God, then the only thing you have is the theology of somebody else. Theology of somebody else's experience. And in our case, it's the experience of Adventist pioneers. And then the solution, well, for example, a solution might be, our ecclesiology is very, it's not church-oriented, it's mission-oriented. Okay, it's not church, it's a missionary movement. Okay, so there is no nurture, there is no, when you are you are saying about soteriology and salvation by faith or works, I personally believe that this push for salvation of works is just a result of pastors who were not around, who were not nurturing their churches, but going around and doing missionary work. They did not have time. So they had to have some kind of support for their missionary travels. And that support has to be, stable and obedient. And what gives the fastest results? Legalism and fear, right? So it comes from necessity, from the necessity of, but I don't think that by changing theology, we can actually sort this out, this fear, uncertainty of salvation and everything. We have to have experience with God, have to have our own encounter with God in 21st century, and be pioneers for our own time, for our own life's sake, to be new pioneers. And I think that every 40 years, this has to happen in every denomination. 40 years, one experience and one, clarity about who we are and what our experience is and what Seventh-day Adventism is, lasts 40 years. That's the expiring date. And then you have to go again for the next generation. That's this Ecclesia reformata sempre Ecclesia reformanda sempre reformata. A church who is reformed, that is reformed continually. Okay, that's Calvin. But we are lazy. We don't do that. We want to claim, we have the truth. We like to, I call that, those, that's fan Christianity. You have fans. Yeah. They don't go deeper into, they just cheer on, but they don't go deeper. They don't contemplate about their own faith. They don't get into the journey, and then of course you're going to struggle with theology that is from the 19th century. It worked for them, okay, and we have to understand that it worked for them. If it wasn't like that, I don't think we will now have Seventh-day Adventist Church. But they had sensibility and they had resilience for that kind of talk and whatnot. But today is different. So we have to have our own experience and then to rethink everything again. And I think Adventism is beautiful, beautiful if we take a look at it from the perspective. If we take a look at it.
We've got an open mic here. Let me make sure I close this. Okay, Marko, that was beautiful. And Emmanuel, thank you. You brought about a very good, very profound answer. I appreciate that. I'm going to go to Dr. Hemmings again.
Yes.
How are you doing, Olive?
Yeah, thank you for this very, very important conversation. And hopefully at some point it will lead to some somehow become therapeutic, but we're ending here. And Marko, I like, again, I really wanted to respond to Lauren's story about his dad on his deathbed, not sure whether he'll be saved. And here Emmanuel bring up the whole concept of soteriology, that soteriology is somewhat flawed. And then bringing in Marko's concept of trauma, that indeed our soteriology, at the root of our soteriology is trauma, the shut door theory. Even though we don't tout it anymore, that's where it's coming from. The door is going to be shut and I will not be saved. That's pure trauma. And so our faith experience has been, and that of the average Seventh-day Adventist, the faith experience is that of trauma. That's why so many parents suffer so much trauma when their kids are not in the church, when they, it's just pure trauma because they're going to go into heaven and not find their kids. So I don't know how we get around that. I think we get around that by recognizing that much of our missionary work or evangelism, ask the question, are we actually inviting people to have a relationship with God or inviting them to have a certain relationship with the church? Are we calling them to church or are we calling them to a relationship with God? Because there's a difference there. You're calling them to the church, it means they have to conform to all these doctrines, dogmas, and so forth. Or if you're calling them to a relationship with God, you're calling them to have a relationship with God, standing in the place in which they find themselves in the world.
Get the rest of that off there. I want to put this table.
And I think we are so fearful that if we do that, we will not be able to control them. We won't be able to corral them, keep them in the church. But perhaps we need to try that. Check that out. Because there are a lot of us now today who now have a relationship with God, who define themselves by their relationship with God rather than their relationship with church. And we're still members, loyal members of the church, contributing to the work of the church. So perhaps we need to look at that and find out, how do we begin that journey of real renewal, real reformation, not simply trying to go back to grasp the old traumatic doctrines, but really trying to hold people's hand and lead them into a relationship with God, not a relationship with the church per se, but one with God.
I love that. I love that, Olive. Olive, it's 3:30. We usually have a little prayer here, just thanking the Lord for being with us, which is a concept we very much believe in, even though we're electronic. Would you have a short prayer for us, and then we'll go on talking anyway. We'll get the rest of these hands.
You asking me or Olive?
I was asking Olive if she'd have a prayer. Please.
God, thank you so much for this wonderful experience that we have here from Sabbath to Sabbath, and we pray that your Spirit will continue to fill up this forum. I thank you for Marko. I pray you continue to bless his work. And I pray you continue to bless each person's present here. May this day continue to be a blessing to them. May they have every reason to rejoice. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much. Olive is just an absolute star for Adventist theology and Adventist today in particular. I have appreciated you so much, my dear friend. And now I'm going to move on to Cheryl. Cheryl, can I ask you to unmute yourself?
Sure. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Where are you from, Cheryl?
I'm from Jamaica. I don't know if that helps you.
Oh, we have a lot of friends here from Jamaica. Welcome. Glad that you're here. Join the conversation.
So I have, I think, a large comment, and then I have a question. So I just want to say, to Bob that you're not the only non-Seventh-day Adventist here. Technically, I'm not even Christian. I'm just here because one of my friends invited me. I was listening when you were talking, Lauren, about the story with your father. Yes. And having both of your parents sick at the same time. That's really, 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 really hard. And I'm sorry that, it's just terrible, and I'm sorry that you had to deal with all of that, and then to deal with your father.
It nearly drove me to break down, to have it all happening at once. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, because yeah, we've dealt with a few deaths in the family, and they've been a few months apart, and I mean, I can't imagine. So yeah. And I think, oh, Emmanuel said not too long ago that the Seventh-day Adventist Church offers salvation by grace, and then when you're in the door, it becomes salvation by works. I just want to let you know, it's not an Adventist thing, it's a church thing. I have visited many denominations, and I used to be a Christian. So, I mean, and I was properly Christian. I was helping to lead things and doing all kinds of stuff. And it is typically how church works, with the understanding that if you are content with the idea that you are saved by grace, then what is going to prevent you from sinning? So we need to make sure that you are clear that in order to remain in God's good graces, you have to do the following 5 things or else. So I think as much as we would, or maybe you would like to believe otherwise, the culture of church and the culture of, I feel relatively confident in saying Christianity, Islam, and Judaism requires that you clearly establish an us versus them. And you clearly have to adhere to the things that we have said. So you can't just, turn up at your service tomorrow or whenever it is that your faith group meets and say that, you have this new idea about God, because we have agreed to a set of ideas, and these are the only ideas that there will be. Any new ideas we're going to brand as evil or demonic. And this is how we're going to maintain the unity of the group, because we agreed to these 10 ancient things, and the 10 ancient things are never going to go away. Mm-hmm. So while I hear, the anguish when Lauren talks about his dad, I also know from experience that when I used to be in church, one of the things I used to do every night was ask God to forgive me of all my sins, because my greatest fear was I was going to die with some unconfessed sin. And then despite all the things, I was going to go straight to hell. So I think the culture of church, and maybe the culture of organized religion in general, breeds this fear and this need to control, and using fear to control people's behavior. So in my experience, it's not an Adventist thing, it's a church thing. And obviously it has many negative effects on people, and it's very, I don't want to say traumatic, because that was what Lauren described it as, but very troubling that you have all of these people who, for all intents and purposes, love God, and they believe that where they are is where they're supposed to be. And yet this very fundamental thing that is supposed to be, the gospel, which is supposed to be about salvation and supposed to be about being right with God and all of the good things that are supposed to come out of that. But at the end of the day, it's like a mythical thing that nobody can really claim, because everybody is running around terrified because your larger faith community tells you that at any moment this can go away. So, I mean, that's just, the more I say it, the more it really just, I begin to understand why Lauren got angry. But as somebody who is not Adventist at all and is very much on the outside, it's definitely a church thing. All right, so
you're saying that what we're experiencing here is not atypical.
No, it's not. It's definitely a church.
But I also think, as you say some of these things, that there's also a place, Cheryl, in any religious space to say we have this set of disciplines that we share. Mm-hmm. And for me, the Sabbath, I always thought was a very nice discipline that I loved sharing with my family. Some people didn't, but I did. And so it puzzles me about where do you find the space between what you should do and is helpful to do as a discipline that we share, as opposed to the way some of these disciplines really hurt some of us. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Okay, so you have a discipline that has benefit and is potentially unifying, but on the flip side of it, it's harming some of the people in the community?
Yes, precisely.
Okay. I mean, I'm not I'm not like the best poised to answer that, but it would seem to me that if you use the example of observing the Sabbath as a discipline that has benefit, but that can also be problematic for some of the members of the community, I think an open discussion about it might be the best way to go. So if I'm having a problem with the Sabbath, and I am free to say to you, Lauren, hey, I hate the Sabbath because of X, then you can have a conversation and begin to see, is X really the problem? And what is it that might be in your mindset that's making the Sabbath difficult for you? And what is it that's in your mindset that makes the Sabbath something you enjoy? And if you can have that free discourse, I think it might help.
Yeah. Marko, do you want to weigh in on this? I think that Cheryl has raised some good points.
No, that's yeah. I agree. It's a church thing, because whenever I speak to others, I actually think that there is a connection between the call to get out of the Babylon and the fact that in the New Jerusalem there is no temple, which means there is no organized religion. And when I told my children, my daughters, about the fact that there is no church in heaven and that Jesus speaks, he is the one who is actually the pastor, they said yes. It was the major joy. And then I understood that we are missing something completely, and that's, religion is a system of control, and getting out of Babylon is getting out of that system of control in order to experience love, because love cannot exist without control, and God is love. Somehow, what church for me is the church which is healthy and growing and bringing people freedom is the experience of God's love. Doesn't matter if you're in or outside, and people light up when they have freedom to actually explore God and His ways in their own experience. That is the church. That's the New Testament church. And I think that many people would give everything they have to support that kind of church, if that would exist. And back in New Testament, you have Acts 4, when you see that exactly happened. People are not stupid. They can recognize something that is completely honest and free and good and nurturing and invites people who want to be moral, who want to be loving, but it doesn't control them.
Yeah.
But how to actually have that, I don't know, on the margins probably, of real churches.
This was a really good.
I'm not saying that Adventism is Babylon. I'm saying that controlling church, that doesn't matter if it is Adventist or Catholic or whichever, controlling church is Babylon. And people have to leave that. Okay, not to be afraid of that. To find, to have some kind of community where people will not, with Adventists, with those Adventists will not control each other, but support each other. That's
Cheryl.
So I just want to, just ask my question. So I know that there's been discussion about how do we read the Old Testament, and is this the God that we are talking about? And somebody mentioned a pastor who, I guess, let everybody know that he's bisexual, and then I'm sure the ensuing furor over that. So I no longer need like a biblical support for anything. I just make decisions based on what I think is best. But I know from my history with being in church that as you're describing it, when you say, okay, but the eunuch is a representative of somebody whose sexual orientation is different and all of that. I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, I'm curious as to how you do that, because I know right now, if I go outside and I say to somebody, hey, what is God's stance on gay people? I'm going to get all the scriptures thrown at me. And even the people who don't know scriptures are going to be like, well, obviously gays should die. So I want to know how you have come to a point being in church to say that this is not the correct approach to the gay community, and how you've come to a point being in church where you can look at the Old Testament and talk to me about the psychosocial state of the people writing it, when one of the foundational tenets, as I understand it, is that God is both omnipotent and omniscient. So how is he not able to ensure that how the Old Testament is written is exactly how he wants it written?
Go for it, Marko.
Well, can you simplify the question, please? Because it was very long, and I couldn't...
So 2 questions, if you want to look at it that way. 1, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, how do you start from that basis to say that the Old Testament is not the correct view, for want of a better way of putting that, of looking at God? In other words, if the people who are writing it are traumatized and their trauma has influenced how they've described God, but God is omnipotent and omniscient, shouldn't he be able to ensure that the people writing it, even there?
Well, then you will have to have this kind of different kind of understanding and inspiration. We have, as Adventists, we have an understanding of inspiration that the word is not inspired, but the person who is writing it. And the word is, which is written, has this divine element, which is inspiration, and then human element, which is words and emotions and everything that how humans understood that revelation. So that's, yeah, God is omnipotent and omniscient and, omnipresent, but the way he deals with people and his prophets is by giving them the message and then leaving them to translate that message into human words. That's how there is this dictate the nature of the people who believe that God dictates every word. That's not how the whole thing is going about. And that's, as Adventists, we were close to the prophet who had the same kind of experience. God gave her the visions, and then she translated those visions into, basically every prophetic writing is basically interpretation of what they saw. The personal interpretation of what they saw, not the dictate. Yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, I get you. And then the second part of that was, I understand the I'm going to say acceptance, for want of a better word, towards the LGBTQ community in this group. But I'm saying, how do you reconcile that with all of the scriptures that I'm sure people quote to say that, homosexuality is wrong, and so the church should not be a place that is safe for people in that community? Well,
now it becomes a topic. I don't know. I really don't know. We don't have. I don't have that kind of experience with people here.
Okay.
What I have found is that, for example, I know one bisexual who he's not a member of our church, but I know him, and we are on 12 steps, and I'm his sponsor. And then he has his own way of dealing with that.
Okay.
it's basically, he doesn't act on it. He never did, but he knows that he's attracted to both sexes. And that's what he, experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we as Adventists did not have any honest conversations with those people.
Okay.
In order to actually get to some position, official position, that will, in which we will be able to actually, at the moment, I don't like ostracizing. I don't like. It's almost the attitude is almost like they're not even human.
Mm.
And those are human experiences, and that's what I would advocate for their chance to be Adventists and to have their own struggle with their temptations. The same way that married people have their own struggle with temptations towards the opposite sex all the time. So that's
Okay.
that's
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that's
No,
me.
no, I
At the
understand.
moment, that's me. Yeah.
Cheryl, I
understand.
posted it in the best book I know about working through this problem biblically is the one I just posted about by Alicia Johnston.
Okay, I see the link.
Absolutely excellent book. And I've had Alicia here speaking, and she will come back again. We only have a few minutes left. I wanted to get in Bob and Emmanuel. I hope you don't mind, since you've spoken before. I'm gonna go right to Gerald and Sherry.
Thank you. Lauren and I have had this conversation before. Lauren, when you mentioned your father and his doubts near death, my father didn't have that doubt, but early in his life did, and decided, if God is a fire and brimstone God, I want no part of it. Once he heard about a God who was kind, who was inviting, who was a good God, he chose back in. And I think that's what we all need to do. I mentioned on the chat that I have reshaped some of my beliefs about Revelation and end time events. And I'll suggest here that one of the ways to do it is to leave confusion is our individual task. To make things straight in our minds. And I think that's the basis on which God can judge our intentions. I don't think it's essential that we have it all right, because I believe that the millennium is the time when we are all going to get it together and have plenty of time sitting at Jesus' feet to learn the nuances that we didn't ever get quite right, but resolved to do so. Finally, Blaise Pascal and his ideas about religion still form a basis for my beliefs, which is, if there's a God and he's a good God, then it's probably worth working on this and being on his side. If there isn't a God, being a nice guy still pays dividends here, and I want to keep doing that. What do you guys think? Can we make a religion about that, or get out of it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's actually the Pascal wager has been discussed a great deal, and positive and negative. Maybe we need a class on that sometime. Thank you, Gerald. Let me make sure we have enough time here for Sherry Craig.
Okay, I'll be very brief. It is so heartbreaking to hear your father's fears when he was dying, but he is in league with many, many Adventists. I was the hospice social worker for the Collegedale area, so of course I had a lot of Adventist patients, and without a doubt, the Adventists are the ones who most fear being saved. I mean, I heard it over and over and over again. So we need to work on that for sure. That's all.
I agree completely. The one thing, at least, that people ought to get out of their faith is the assurance of salvation. They ought to be able to go to their deaths with peace. And that's what made me so angry, that my good father, because of how he was raised in the Seventh-day Adventist understanding of perfection, could not go to his death with peace. Brian, you wanted to say just a word before we leave here about Brian is our representative here from the kinship LGBTQ plus community. Brian, just a moment we have left.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the book. I think you mentioned Alicia's book, which I think is a really good way for people to get some understanding of how the church could view that issue differently.
Yeah.
But I mean, here's a glib answer. I mean, it's kind of that the Bible doesn't actually address that issue. And so I think that, and as Marko has been talking about, we're writing the 67th book of the Bible, and I think this is part of that 67th book. And I know, Lauren, you've mentioned this before too, that, you know, the church rewrote part of the Bible too, in the sense of slavery. So why would we not also be able to grapple with an issue like LGBTQ individuals and where they fit into God's kingdom? So I guess I would wanted to just chime in with that from kinship's perspective, the Bible doesn't really directly address the issue, and thus we must use principles. And I think the principle of God's love, and I, you know, we talk often about Jesus and his eating with sinners, and I don't think LGBT people are sinners for being LGBT, but the point being that Jesus included a lot of people that we might not feel comfortable including, and I think he very much included the LGBT community at his table back in the day. So the eunuchs, as we often refer to that. So anyway, I just wanted to, you know, assure, and because I think it was Cheryl that had brought that up, and I think there are many of us in the church who have reevaluated what the Bible has to say. And I think, first of all, that doesn't really say anything about that topic. And then secondly, that God's love is inclusive enough to take in all of God's children, regardless of their differences in their sexual orientation and so on.
Something I'd like you or someone to address sometime.
Yeah. Well, you know, we have the one recording from ways back too. You could also share that, the one from, I don't know, last year, fall, I think I did one. Yeah. And Alicia's.
We do have most of our recordings, some of the recent ones, up on our YouTube site. Something I'd like you or somebody to address sometime is this difference between biblical commands and ethics. And I think Adventists have a real hard time with that. You know, we will only apply ethical principles if we can find absolutely nothing in the Bible to tell us what to do. And, you know, for example, we ended up with some very odd ideas about abortion, and kind of made it in our own.